don't think there's any other word for it, frankly. Hatred for men coming from certain quarters of the feminist movement.
Yeah, so I do talk about the history of that as well, because most people think toxic masculinity, the concept maybe arose in the 1960s, second wave feminism. It actually goes much further back, and we need to understand that if we're going to counter it effectively. It turns out it goes all the way back to the 19th century. You can see, I was surprised when I read the literature of the 19th century that it was often just as hostile as what we see today. And what people were protesting against actually was, as Western society secularized, the concept of masculinity changed. Let's start with the Industrial Revolution. Before that, most men worked with their family members, with their wives and children all day in the family industry, the family farm, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men focused much more on their caretaking role. In fact, interesting historical fact, most books on childbearing were addressed to fathers, not to mothers as they are today, because fathers were considered the primary parent. And they did, in fact, spend as much time with their children throughout the day as mothers did. It's hard for us to imagine that because we're so used to men being out of the home all day. But in fact, boy, especially with their boys, right? Men were training them in the adult skills that they would need. And I think it's interesting that even secular historians will say the concept of masculine virtue at that time was duty to God and man. A sense of duty was very strong in the colonial era. I start with them. I limit my discussion to America just to keep it limited. But where did we lose that? The Industrial Revolution took men out of the home, right? It took work out of the home, and men had to follow their work into offices and factories. And for the first time, they were not working alongside their family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's when we see the literature start to change. You start to see people protesting that men were losing their caretaking ethos, that they were becoming egocentric, self-centered, aggressive, acquisitive, greedy and acquisitive, to use the language of the day, treating their job as their idol, getting their self-identity not from their family relationships, but from individual achievement in the workplace. And on top of that, as the Industrial Revolution built up a large public sphere of institutions like factories and offices and financial institutions and universities and the state, people began to argue that these large public institutions should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public realm. And since it was men who were getting that secular education and working in that secular realm, they also began to be less governed by more traditional theistic Christian understandings of masculinity. And so historians agree that the 19th century saw a huge increase of drinking, gambling, gang activity, crime, prostitution, because men were becoming more secular in their outlook. And the 19th century, as a result, was also the period of great reform movements. But the reform movements were all basically focused on male misbehavior, that men were starting to act differently because they were no longer embedded in their family, in their church, in their local community anymore. So historically, if you go back to the 19th century, it's amazing how already then you see the language. Well, let me give you a quote. So one of my favorite historians puts it this way. All of the reform movements of the 19th century were implicit condemnations of males. Why? Because there was little doubt as to the sex of the tavern keeper, the slave master, the drunkard, and the seducer. That's her quote. So a lot of the hostile language toward men actually goes back to that era. And of course, that does also indicate what the solution must be. The solution has to be, how can we reconnect men to their families? How can we reconnect men to their children, and especially the next generation of sons? A psychiatrist wrote a book in which he said, we're not going to get a better class of men until we get a better class of fathers raising the next generation. So in my book, I end up saying that the long-term solution is to recover, especially the father-son relationship. That's the main solution to any sort of toxic behavior in men.